Resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to start by indicating that I'll be sharing my time with the member from Vancouver East. And I thought I might start my reflections on the budget just by noticing some things in the budget that I think are a step in the right direction. Those are, I'm thinking specifically, Mr. Speaker, of the provisions for parental leave, and I'm thinking also of the now 5 days paid leave for Canadians fleeing situations of domestic violence. I think that is good. In the fall, when the government announced this measure, it was 3 unpaid days, and there was some great work by some of my colleagues on the NDP benches here to point out that would be hard to access for folks who are leaving difficult situations and don't have the luxury of missing paid days of work. So I thought that was a positive change. And for people in Manitoba, in the province that I represent, that now means that they're covered both at the federal level and the provincial level, because the previous NDP government also introduced provisions for paid leave for folks fleeing domestic violence. So that's good news for Manitobans to now be covered at both levels. I do want to say that I think one of the major themes of the budget or emissions of the budget, it's important whether you're looking at it from the point of view of fiscal responsibility or the point of view of social justice, Madam Speaker, is the lack of serious action when it comes to going after tax evasion, whether that's through tax havens or other kinds of significant tax loopholes, because that contributes to on the fiscal responsibility side. That's lost revenue for government that really ought to be here and contributing to balancing the books. And on the social justice side, that's also money that can be spent on the kinds of things that Canadians need, whether that's expanding their drug coverage through a national pharmacare plan, whether it's investing in affordable housing, which we know is a crisis for many Canadians right across the country. So whether you're looking at it from either of those sides, hemorrhaging that amount of money off to other jurisdictions where we have special sweetheart deals is a serious problem, and it's something I'm sad to see the government didn't take the opportunity to address. But it's in keeping with the kind of sweetheart treatment that they give a lot of big players when it comes to major CEOs who continue to benefit from the CEO stock option tax loophole. Which is infuriating for Canadians who are seeing the cost of housing and other important costs go up, and continue to watch the people at the top end of the earning spectrum be able to save money on their taxes because they have the ability to be paid in stock options instead of by salary. And we saw this kind of we see this special treatment when we think of financial consulting firms like KPMG, who have been reported to be right at the center of some of the largest tax evasion schemes, and yet are being treated with kid gloves by this government. We saw the kind of natural affinity that the finance minister has for the banking sector when there was controversy over the past year about the government depriving credible financial institutions like credit unions, all of the credit unions across the country, from being able to use the language of banking services and banking, which is the common sense term that Canadians use when they talk about making deposits and other kinds of investments or getting their mortgage. And they trust credit unions to do that. Credit unions do a good job of that. But because the banks decided to undermine their competition and they knew they had a friendly ear in the finance minister was quick to jump when they said that maybe credit unions shouldn't be able to use that language. And it's frustrating to see that kind of special treatment for banks when banks don't afford that same respect to the communities that they serve. And we're seeing that happen right now in Transcona, Madam Speaker, where the TD Bank, which has recorded the highest level of profits for any bank in Canada this year, is closing a local branch that's been the cornerstone of Transcona's downtown for decades and decades and decades. And they're not saying it's because they were losing money at the branch. They're saying, they want to increase their overall profits across the country by 1% or a fraction of a percent. So they're closing branches in communities like Transcona all across the country regardless of the cost and the toll that takes on the people in those communities who've been faithful customers and want to be able to access in-person banking services in their community. You contrast that with credit unions who came under fire from this government in terms of using the language of banking and banking services, who are responsible to their customers and are keeping local branches open and doing that quite successfully from a financial point of view, and the contrast is stark, Madam Speaker. A theme of this budget, as reported by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and we've heard over a number of days now debate about that, and we've heard it in question period, is the fact that, first of all, although having announced over $186 billion in infrastructure money, most of which is to come long after this Parliament has come and gone, and hopefully, Madam Speaker, long after this government has come and gone, despite having announced that big number, there's no plan for how to spend what they're calling a record amount of money on infrastructure, Madam Speaker, which is totally irresponsible, for one thing. But it is also important to note, when I talk about that money coming later and after the next election, that of the small amount of money that is actually to be spent in this Parliament, the PBO reported that approximately 25% of that much smaller amount of infrastructure money will be allowed to lapse instead of actually being invested in our communities. And we're living that right now in Winnipeg, where Red River College, who's our biggest community college by far, wanted to make an investment in Winnipeg's downtown through a new innovation center. That's a center that was meant to help startup businesses in the tech sector, again, among others, and to have a good collaborative relationship between the college and the private sector in Winnipeg's downtown, has had to put a hold on the tenders for that $90 million project because of the $40 million that was announced to support it by the federal government. That money has a quite unrealistic deadline in terms of when they expect completion, when the federal government is demanding that the project be completed. So much so that the college has had to put a hold on those tenders, and what that means is the potential for missing out on a total $90 million investment in post-secondary education right in the heart of Winnipeg's downtown, which would also have an important economic benefit to Winnipeg's downtown. And so when we hear about the lapsed funding, we hear oftentimes from the government, oh, well, that's because, it takes time to finish projects and the receipts haven't come in. But in this case, we see quite clearly, and I'm sure it's not the only instance across the country, where it's actually unrealistic parameters being put by the federal government on the project that is the problem. Now, I understand that the Minister of Natural Resources and the member for Winnipeg South Centre has been trying to advocate within his own government for that project. At least that's my understanding. Members opposite can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I think what that signals is a problem that he's not being taken seriously enough within his own government, and why it is that the only cabinet minister for Manitoba's say-so wouldn't be good enough, or the 7 Liberals that represent Winnipeg ridings wouldn't be able to have influence within that government, I think is troubling. And I would forgive Winnipeggers who are wondering at the value of electing 7 Liberals to represent a city if it's going to mean that they get taken for granted and some of the major infrastructure projects committed to by the federal government don't get the follow-through that it deserves, Madam Speaker. And so they may be wondering that. Or they may be wondering if maybe this is a problem with the way that the Liberals have set up the regional economic development agencies, where instead of having ministers from the region being responsible for economic development activities, instead that's all consolidated under one minister, in this case from Southern Ontario, who doesn't understand projects in Manitoba and doesn't understand the needs of Winnipeg, and is clearly ignoring his colleague from Manitoba instead of moving ahead with a very valuable project. I say all that just to show that when we talk about lapsed funding in infrastructure, the numbers sometimes are quite big, and it can be quite abstract and kind of hard to get your head around. But those are the kinds of very concrete problems that those numbers represent in Winnipeg and across the country when you start talking about lapsed infrastructure funding. So I'm very sorry that I don't have more time to get into more of the issues with the budget. I've tried to show how some of those issues come right back to home and affect us. So as much as it sounds like Pickering here in Ottawa, or as much as the numbers may be hard to get our head around, they really do have real consequences for us here at home.
Questions on comments? The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I would like to ask my honourable colleague, does he understand that the Canadian economic and the prosperity that Canada enjoys today, the standard of living Canadians enjoys today, earlier it was based on the natural resources, the forestry product, the fossil fuels, the minerals, and to an extent with basic industries like aluminium, steel, auto, and aviation. But things are changing today. You know, Madam Speaker, about 25, 30 years back, Canada was number 2 or number 3 in the world in aluminium production. But in the last 25, 30 years, we have not seen one single new smelter coming up. The future of Canadians, the jobs for the Canadians of today and tomorrow, Madam Speaker, is in knowledge-based economy. I would like to know if the member appreciates the kind of investments we are doing in the innovation sector, in the technology sector for innovation, and be leading the knowledge-based economy, which is creating a level playing field globally. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I understand quite well the importance of the information economy that's emerging and the role of innovation. And that's why one of the major themes of my speech centered around a new innovation center for Winnipeg, spearheaded by Red River College, that had over $40 million in federal money announced, that the federal government itself is now putting in jeopardy by holding the college to an unrealistic deadline in order to get it done. And so we're actually watching that member's government observe the collapse of a good project, and I hope they will change their mind on this. It's important that they do. They committed the money, but now because of unrealistic deadlines, it's not going ahead. The tenders that the college was putting out for its innovation center have been withdrawn because of uncertainty around the funding coming through if they don't meet what is an unrealistic deadline. And that situation was created by a long delay by the federal government within its own program for approving the project in the first place. That's the truth. It was one of the last projects approved. It took somewhere in the vicinity of a year, I think, to approve that project. And that's part of the reason of the delay. So if they take innovation seriously, they should allow the project to proceed.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Elmwood Transcona for his comments, especially on the infrastructure issue.
I just want to remind the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, if he's got questions, he'll be able to stand up and ask for those questions. I would just also like to remind the member from Elmwood Transcona that instead of trying to keep a conversation going while someone's trying to ask him a question, he should maybe pay a little bit more attention. The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, I want to thank my colleague from Elmwood Transcona for his comments, especially on the infrastructure. Now, I was watching the Parliamentary Budget Officer last night comment of the $182 billion of a historic investment that the Liberal government announced. $90 billion is actually holdover announcements and investments from the previous government. $70 billion could not actually be found. Now, he was commenting about issues with his college. Yesterday, I commented about in Alberta, we were underfunded per capita 20%. For transit infrastructure. I notice Manitoba, despite all these Liberal MPs, is underfunded per capita 43% for the infrastructure funding. I wonder if perhaps my colleague could comment on the unfairness of how the government distributes its money.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much. And I mean, yes, I think this is a real problem, and it's been a recurring theme that in our Liberal representatives from Manitoba, we just don't have the kind of champions we need in order to get what they're calling historical levels of funding. I think there's some fun with numbers there. I mean, if you were to announce federal spending into the year 2075, you would have a historic number. Whether or not you would have anything realistic or useful for contemporary political debate would be another question entirely, but you certainly would have a large number. So, but anyway, by their own admission, or according to their own claim, it's a historical number. But a lot of that money isn't reaching Manitoba. Now, I would say to my honourable friend that we do need Liberal champions in order to get that money into Manitoba. there are some other issues about why some of that money is not making it to Manitoba. Particularly when you mention transit, I think of our Conservative government in Manitoba that just brutally slashed funding to Winnipeg Transit and has apparently been sitting on a report on the electrification of its bus fleet for over 20 months while saying they didn't have it. And so there are some deep political issues when it comes to transit in Winnipeg right now. And much as we might all like to, they can't all be blamed on the Liberal Party of Canada.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I've had the opportunity